I am Rachel Torres, 28, a software engineer in Austin, and my hands trembled as I stared at the email that just arrived from my father's company, the subject line reading, "Urgent. Board meeting tonight. Your attendance required." Which was strange because I hadn't spoken to my family in 3 years, not since the night they laughed at me for choosing tech over law, calling me a failure to the Torres legacy of lawyers. But what they didn't know was that the anonymous whistleblower who just exposed their firm's massive embezzlement scandal, causing 3 partners to be arrested and their precious legacy to crumble, was their biggest disappointment, their failure of a daughter who'd spent 3 years gathering evidence of their crimes. And before I tell you how I brought down the empire that rejected me, let me know where you're watching from, and remember that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply becoming everything they said you'd never be. Growing up as the youngest daughter in a family of lawyers was like being raised in a courtroom where every conversation was a cross-examination and love was conditional on your ability to argue your case, with my father Eduardo Torres running the most prestigious law firm in Texas and my mother Catherine serving as a federal judge, while my older siblings Diana and Robert were already partners at 28 and 30 respectively, making me the only Torres who showed no interest in legal briefs or case law, preferring to spend my time taking apart computers and learning to code, which my family treated like a cute hobby that I'd grow out of once I got serious about my future. The pressure started early with my parents enrolling me in debate clubs and mock trial teams, where I consistently disappointed them by being more interested in building the software to track argument points than actually making the arguments, leading to countless family dinners where my father would slam his fist on the table and demand to know why I was wasting the Torres brain on playing with computers like some basement dweller, while my siblings smirked at my latest failure to live up to the family name. By high school, I was secretly teaching myself programming languages while pretending to study for the LSATs, hiding coding books inside legal textbooks, staying up all night to build websites and apps while my family thought I was reviewing case studies, living a double life where I'd attend family firm events in the evening, then rush home to work on hackathons and programming competitions that I never told them about because I knew they'd only mock my little computer games, as they called anything involving technology. The breaking point came during my senior year of college when I received 2 life-changing opportunities on the same day: acceptance to Harvard Law School, which my parents had apparently pulled strings to ensure despite my mediocre LSAT scores, and a job offer from a major tech company in Austin that had seen my work at a programming competition, offering me 6 figures to start as a software engineer. And I knew that choosing between them meant choosing between my family's approval and my own happiness. The family dinner where I announced my decision was supposed to be a celebration of my Harvard acceptance, with my parents having invited their partners and important clients to witness another Torres joining the legal dynasty. Champagne already poured, and toasts prepared about carrying on the tradition, when I stood up and announced that I'd declined Harvard and accepted a position as a software engineer instead, watching the room fall silent as glasses stopped midway to lips and my father's face turned a shade of red I'd only seen during his most brutal court arguments. "This is a joke," he said slowly, setting down his champagne with deliberate control. "Tell me this is your idea of a poorly timed joke, Rachel." But when I shook my head and explained that I'd already signed the employment contract, that I'd found my passion in technology, not law, the controlled facade cracked, and he erupted in a tirade about throwing away generations of legal excellence for typing on a keyboard like a secretary, while my mother sat frozen with mortification as their colleagues witnessed a Torres choosing what they saw as mediocrity over magnificence. My sister Diana laughed openly, that cruel sound I'd heard throughout childhood whenever I'd failed to meet their standards, saying, "I always knew you didn't have what it takes to be a real Torres, but I didn't think you'd be pathetic enough to admit it publicly," while Robert added his own dismissal about how some people are meant to be leaders and others are meant to be worker bees. And I stood there absorbing their contempt, their disappointment, their complete inability to see value in anything outside their narrow definition of success. The final blow came from my mother, who had remained silent until then, her judge's face impassive as she delivered her verdict. "If you walk away from this opportunity, from your family's legacy, from everything we've built for you, then you're walking away from this family entirely, because I won't have people knowing that a Torres chose to waste her potential on whatever it is you think you're doing. And the dismissal in her voice, when she couldn't even name my career path, told me everything I needed to know about how they saw my dreams. That night ended with my father standing at the head of the table, pointing at me with the same finger he used to intimidate witnesses, declaring, "You want to throw your life away playing with computers? Fine. But don't come crying to us when you realize what a mistake you've made. When you're 30 and still just another replaceable coder while your siblings are partners and judges, when you finally understand that we were trying to save you from mediocrity." And those words, that prediction of my worthlessness, became the fuel that would drive me for the next 3 years. I left Houston the next week with 2 suitcases and no goodbye, my family having made it clear that I was no longer welcome at firm events or family gatherings until I came to my senses, and I drove to Austin with a mixture of heartbreak and liberation, knowing I was trading everything familiar for the unknown, but feeling more like myself than I had in 22 years of trying to force myself into their mold. The tech job was everything I'd dreamed of and more, surrounding me with people who got excited about elegant code and innovative solutions rather than billable hours and case precedents, where success was measured in problems solved rather than opponents destroyed, where collaboration mattered more than competition. And I threw myself into the work with the kind of passion my family had always wanted me to show for law, but which had only ever come naturally with technology. Within 6 months, I'd been promoted, my manager recognizing what my family never had, that I had an instinct for finding vulnerabilities in systems, for seeing patterns others missed, for understanding how pieces fit together in ways that revealed both strengths and weaknesses. Skills that made me valuable in cybersecurity, where thinking like both a builder and a breaker was essential. My apartment was small, but mine decorated with programming books and computer parts instead of law degrees and family photos, and I built a life completely separate from the Torres legacy, making friends who knew me as Rachel the brilliant coder rather than Rachel the failed lawyer, finding my tribe among people who celebrated my victories in hackathons and security conferences, rather than dismissing them as playing with toys. The silence from my family was total. No calls on my birthday. No invitations to holidays. No acknowledgement that I existed, except for the occasional update from a cousin who'd let slip that my parents told everyone I was taking time to find myself or that I was working abroad. Anything but admitting their daughter had chosen technology over law, and I learned to live with the absence, to fill the void with meaningful work and genuine friendships. Everything changed when I accidentally discovered the first thread of what would become my family's downfall, ironically while working on a cybersecurity project for a client that happened to share office space with the company my father's firm represented. And through a misconfigured server, I stumbled upon financial documents that didn't add up, transactions that looked suspiciously like money laundering, patterns that my trained eye recognized as classic embezzlement, hidden behind legal maneuvers. My first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen evidence that the great Torres family firm was built on criminal foundations. But the more I looked, the more I found. Shell companies, offshore accounts, client funds mysteriously redirected, a systematic fraud that went back years and implicated not just my father, but several senior partners, including my siblings who'd apparently learned more than legal ethics from our parents. The ethical hacker in me knew I should report it immediately, but the wounded daughter wanted to understand the full scope first, so I spent months carefully gathering evidence, using every skill they'd mocked to uncover every transaction, every hidden account, every client they'd defrauded, building an airtight case that no legal maneuvering could escape, all while maintaining my silence and letting them continue to believe I was failing at my little computer job. The irony wasn't lost on me that the skills they'd dismissed as worthless were the very ones revealing their crimes, that the daughter they'd rejected for lacking legal ambition was about to bring down their legal empire, that the replaceable coder had skills they couldn't even comprehend, let alone defend against, and I found myself working late into the night, driven by a mixture of justice and vindication. 3 months into my investigation, I had everything. Proof of embezzlement totaling millions, evidence of tax fraud, Documentation of client betrayal that would destroy not just the firm, but the Torres reputation my family valued above all else. And I sat in my apartment staring at the compiled evidence, knowing I held their fate in my hands the same way they'd once held mine, except I would be more merciful than they had been. I could have sent everything to the FBI immediately, but I wanted them to know it was me. Wanted them to understand that the daughter they'd thrown away had become their downfall. So I created an anonymous whistleblower identity and began releasing information strategically, starting with small hints that made them nervous, then gradually escalating to specific transactions they'd have to scramble to explain. The first leak made the local news, a concerned insider revealing questionable billing practices at the prestigious Torres firm, and I watched from afar as my father did damage control, his confident television appearance not quite hiding the worry in his eyes, while my mother maintained judicial distance, but I knew she was complicit, had seen her signature on too many suspicious documents to believe otherwise. Each revelation was carefully timed for maximum impact, released just as they thought they'd contained the previous scandal, a slow tightening noose that gave them hope of escape before closing another inch, and I monitored their communications through the same vulnerabilities they'd never bothered to fix because technology was beneath them, watching them panic and blame everyone but themselves. The beauty of my plan was that everything I revealed was true and documented, no fabrication needed when their actual crimes were worse than anything I could invent, and I made sure each leak included irrefutable evidence that would stand up in court, the kind of detailed documentation that only someone with intimate knowledge of both technology and their operations could provide, though they never suspected the Torres failure might be their downfall. By month 4, the FBI was investigating. Partners were fleeing, clients were suing, and the Torres empire was crumbling in real time, while I continued my normal life in Austin, going to work, improving my skills, building legitimate success while they destroyed themselves with the weight of their own corruption. And I felt no guilt because I wasn't destroying them. I was simply revealing who they'd always been beneath the prestigious facade. The night before the final revelation that would lead to arrests, I sat in my apartment with my laptop, holding the last piece of evidence that would ensure my father and siblings faced prison time, and my phone rang for the first time in 3 years. My mother's name appearing like a ghost from another life, and I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won, wanting to hear what she'd say, not knowing her daughter held her fate in anonymous hands. Rachel. Her voice was different, lacking its usual judicial authority. I know you haven't wanted contact, but something's happening with the firm. Someone's attacking us, and we need all the help we can get, even if you only know computers. Maybe you could help us understand who's doing this. And the desperation in her voice, the way she still couldn't acknowledge my actual expertise even while begging for it, made my decision final. I can't help you, I said simply. I'm just a replaceable coder, remember? Someone who chose mediocrity over magnificence? Surely the great Torres legal minds can handle this without their failure of a daughter. And I heard her sharp intake of breath, the recognition that her words were being thrown back at her. But she still didn't apologize, still couldn't admit they'd been wrong about my worth. This is different, she pressed. Our entire legacy is at stake. Everything your father built, everything we've worked for. And I almost laughed at her priorities, still focused on legacy and reputation, rather than the crimes they'd committed, the people they'd hurt, the ethics they'd violated while preaching about justice and law. And I realized they'd never change, never see beyond their own narrow definitions of success and failure. Your legacy was built on lies and theft, I said quietly. And someone with the skills you mocked is exposing it all, showing the world who the Torres family really is beneath the suits and verdicts. And maybe if you'd valued other forms of intelligence, other types of expertise, you'd have seen this coming or been able to stop it. But you were too arrogant to believe anyone outside your profession could touch you. And I hung up before she could respond, knowing it was the last time we'd speak as family. The next morning, I released everything. Comprehensive documentation of 2 decades of financial crimes. Names, dates, amounts, methods. all packaged in a way that made it impossible for law enforcement to ignore and impossible for the Torres firm to spin, watching the news explode with breaking: major law firm partners arrested in massive embezzlement scheme. While I sat in my office, writing code for a legitimate company that valued my contributions. My father's perp walk made national news. The great Eduardo Torres in handcuffs. His empire dissolved overnight, while Diana and Robert faced their own charges, their legal degrees useless against the evidence I had compiled with my worthless tech skills, and I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness, vindication tempered by the loss of a family that had never really been mine anyway. The emails started flooding in from relatives, family, friends, people who'd watched me be dismissed and were now reaching out to say they'd always known I was special, that they'd never agreed with how my parents treated me. Retroactive support that meant nothing after years of silence. And I deleted them all, having learned that the only validation that mattered came from within and from people who'd valued me when I had nothing to prove. 6 months later, I was promoted to head of cybersecurity at my company, my role in exposing the Torres firm having become industry legend, even though I never publicly claimed credit, and I stood in my new office, looking out at the Austin skyline, thinking about how different my life was from what they'd planned, how much better it was than what they'd wanted for me, how their rejection had freed me to become who I really was, instead of who they needed me to be. The letter from my mother arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded through my company since she didn't have my personal address, her judicial stationery now, just paper since she'd been forced to resign in disgrace, and her handwriting was shaky as she admitted, knowing about the crimes, choosing to ignore them for the sake of family legacy, and finally, at the end, acknowledging that maybe there was more than one way to seek justice, more than one kind of intelligence worth valuing. I didn't respond because there was nothing left to say. No relationship to salvage from the ashes of their empire. No family to return to even if I'd wanted it. But I kept the letter as a reminder that sometimes the people who call you a failure are projecting their own moral failings. That sometimes choosing your own path despite their mockery is the greatest success story of all. A year after the arrests, I was invited to speak at a cybersecurity conference about ethical hacking and the importance of protecting against insider threats, and I stood before an audience of my peers, people who understood and valued what I did, who saw technology as a tool for justice rather than a toy for dropouts. And I thought about that family dinner years ago when they'd laughed at my dreams, when they'd predicted I'd be nothing but a replaceable coder begging for their acceptance. The most dangerous vulnerabilities, I told the audience, are often the ones hidden by arrogance, by the assumption that your walls are too high for anyone to breach, that your position is too powerful for anyone to challenge. And the best security experts understand that threats can come from anywhere, even from sources you've dismissed as insignificant. And I saw nods of understanding from people who'd been underestimated too. The talk was a success, leading to job offers from major companies and government agencies who wanted someone with my unique combination of technical skills and real-world experience. And I realized that my family's rejection had accidentally given me the perfect resume. The Torres failure who'd exposed one of the biggest legal frauds in Texas history, using skills they'd mocked, proof that expertise comes in many forms, and dismissing any of them is dangerous. I chose to stay with my current company, loyalty mattering more to me than money, but I negotiated a significant raise and the authority to build my own team, surrounding myself with brilliant misfits who'd been underestimated too, creating a department where diverse thinking was valued over conventional credentials, where results mattered more than pedigree, where no one would ever be mocked for choosing their passion over someone else's expectations. The Forbes article about young tech leaders featured me 6 months later, though they could only speculate about my role in the Torres firm collapse since I'd never confirmed it publicly. But the journalist noted that I'd built my career in defiance of family expectations and had become a rising star in cybersecurity through talent and determination rather than connections, which felt like another small vindication of the path they'd tried to prevent me from taking. My team developed security software that became industry standard, protecting companies from the kind of vulnerabilities I'd exploited to expose my family. turning my understanding of both legal and technical systems into tools that helped rather than harmed, building something constructive from the destructive skills I'd been forced to develop. And I found peace in knowing that my work now prevented the kind of crimes my family had committed. The speaking engagements continued, companies wanting to hear from someone who understood both the technical and human elements of security. And I became known for my emphasis on ethical hacking, on using skills responsibly, on the importance of protecting the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. Lessons learned from watching my family use their legal knowledge to betray rather than defend their clients' trust. 3 years after that fateful dinner where they'd mocked my choices, I owned a condo with a view of the city, had a team who respected me, industry recognition that opened any door I wanted, and most importantly, the knowledge that I'd built it all myself, without the Torah's name or connections, without their approval or support, proving that their definition of success had been as narrow as their definition of family. The documentary filmmaker reached out through LinkedIn, wanting to tell the story of the Torah's firm collapse from the whistleblower's perspective, promising to protect my anonymity while exploring how someone with inside knowledge and technical expertise had brought down a legal empire. And I agreed to participate with my voice disguised, wanting the story told not for revenge, but as a cautionary tale about arrogance and the danger of dismissing any form of intelligence. They never understood. I told the filmmaker that in the modern world, technology isn't separate from other fields. It's woven through everything. And dismissing it as lesser is like dismissing electricity as just sparks. You might get away with it for a while, but eventually, your ignorance will destroy you. And I thought about my father's sneer when he'd called me a replaceable coder, not understanding that I was learning to see patterns he couldn't imagine. The film was well received, winning awards at several festivals, with critics praising its exploration of family dynamics, professional blindness, and the intersection of technology and justice. And I watched it alone in my apartment, seeing my story told through actors and recreations, feeling strangely detached from the family drama that had once consumed my life, like watching someone else's tragedy that I'd happened to witness. My mother attempted contact once more, through a mutual acquaintance since I'd blocked all direct communication, passing along word that she was writing a book about her fall from grace and wanted to include a chapter on reconciliation with estranged family, but I declined to participate, having no interest in being a redemption prop in her narrative, no desire to pretend forgiveness for the sake of her literary ambitions. The Austin tech community became my real family, people who celebrated each other's successes without competition, who understood that intelligence came in many forms, who valued what you could build over what you could destroy. And I found myself mentoring young programmers who'd been told they were wasting their potential, sharing my story as proof that following your passion, despite family pressure, was not just possible, but often necessary. 5 years after choosing tech over law, I was recruited by a major cybersecurity firm to head their ethical hacking division, a position that came with a salary that dwarfed what my siblings had made as junior partners. Though money had never been my motivation, simply a pleasant vindication that success could be measured in many ways, and their way had been built on criminal foundations while mine was built on legitimate skill. The interview process included a background check that revealed my connection to the Torres family, and the CEO asked directly about my role in their downfall, having suspected what many in the industry whispered. And I neither confirmed nor denied, but spoke about the importance of ethical standards in any field, about how technical skills without moral foundations were as dangerous as legal knowledge used for crime. We want someone who understands both the technical and ethical dimensions of security, she said, someone who won't just find vulnerabilities, but will help companies fix them responsibly. And your track record suggests you're exactly that person. And I accepted the position, moving into a leadership role that would let me shape how the next generation thought about hacking, security, and the responsible use of technical power. My new office had a view of the entire city, 40 floors up in a building my family would have recognized as success, though they'd never imagined I'd reach it through the path they'd mocked. And I kept one photo on my desk, a screenshot of the news report announcing the Torres firm's closure, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that those who declare you a failure often do so from their own shaky ground. The team I built was diverse in every way, bringing together people who'd been overlooked or dismissed by traditional paths, brilliant minds who'd been told they were wasting their potential by choosing technology over more respectable fields. And together, we became one of the most successful divisions in the company, our work preventing the kind of crimes my family had committed, while celebrating the kind of innovation they'd never understood. I dated occasionally, but was careful about sharing my full story. The Torres name still carrying weight in Texas, even tainted by scandal, and I preferred partners who knew me as Rachel, the security expert, rather than Rachel the whistleblower. Though eventually I met someone who understood both sides and didn't judge me for either, who saw the strength it had taken to stand up to family rather than the betrayal others might perceive. The wedding was small, just friends from the tech community and a few distant relatives who'd supported my choices from the beginning. No toxic family dynamics to navigate, no judgment about my career or choices, just people who loved me for who I'd become rather than who I'd failed to be in my family's eyes. And I realized this was what family should feel like. Supportive, celebratory, proud of your authentic self. Years passed and my career continued to flourish. Each success another refutation of my father's prediction that I'd amount to nothing. Each innovation proof that the skills they'd dismissed as worthless were actually invaluable in the modern world. Each recognition a vindication that choosing passion over expectation had been the right decision, even when it cost me my birth family. The occasional update about my siblings filtered through the legal gossip network, both disbarred and working in non-legal fields, ironically having to rebuild careers from scratch just as I'd done, but without the passion that had driven my success, and I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, just a distant sadness that they'd inherited our parents' narrow vision along with their criminal tendencies. My father died in prison, a heart attack during his 5th year of incarceration, and I learned about it from the news rather than family notification, feeling nothing but a hollow acknowledgement that the man who declared me a failure had died as one himself, his legacy destroyed by the daughter he'd thrown away. Though I took no pleasure in the irony, only relief that his chapter of my story was finally closed. I donated the inheritance I technically deserved, but didn't want to a scholarship fund for young women in technology, specifically those whose families didn't support their career choices, turning blood money into opportunity for others who faced the same dismissal I had, ensuring that my father's ill-gotten gains would support exactly the kind of dreams he'd mocked. The final contact from my mother came through her lawyer, a formal notice that she was relinquishing any claim to maternal rights or expectations, legally severing ties that had been emotionally severed years before, and I signed the papers without hesitation, making official what had been true since that dinner. I was not a Torres, had never really been one, had built my identity on rejection of everything they represented. At 35, I stood before another conference audience, this time delivering the keynote address at one of the largest cybersecurity events in the world, introduced as a pioneer in ethical hacking and corporate security. My bio mentioning nothing about the Torres family or legal connections, just my accomplishments in the field they'd dismissed as beneath our family's standards. Success, I told the packed auditorium, isn't about meeting someone else's expectations or following their prescribed path. It's about finding where your talents meet the world's needs and pursuing that intersection with everything you have, even when the people who should support you most are the ones trying hardest to stop you. And I saw understanding in young faces who'd heard similar dismissals. The questions afterward included one from a young woman whose family wanted her to be a doctor, but who loved coding. And I told her my story publicly for the first time, the whole truth about choosing tech over law and losing my family but finding myself, about how their mockery became my motivation and their dismissal, my freedom, about building a life they couldn't imagine because they'd never bothered to understand who I really was. But wasn't it hard? She asked. Losing your family over career choice? And I thought about how to answer honestly, how to convey the pain without discouraging her from following her own path. How to explain that some prices are worth paying when the alternative is living someone else's life. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, I admitted, but also the most necessary, because staying would have meant killing the person I really was to become someone they could approve of, and that kind of death, the slow suffocation of your true self, is worse than any rejection or abandonment, worse than being called a failure by people whose definition of success is so narrow they can't see past their own choices. The audience erupted in applause, not for my success, but for the honesty, for the acknowledgement that choosing yourself sometimes means losing others, that family isn't always supportive, and that's okay, that you can build a meaningful life from the ashes of their expectations, and I realized this was my true legacy. Not the code I'd written or the crimes I'd exposed, but the permission I gave others to choose themselves. Walking off that stage, I thought about the Torres family legacy my parents had been so desperate to preserve and extend, built on lies and crimes and the assumption that there was only one path to success, and how it had crumbled at the touch of skills they'd mocked, brought down by the daughter they'd discarded. The ultimate proof that their vision had been fatally flawed from the beginning. I am Rachel Torres, 35 now, though I dropped the Torres name years ago, a successful cybersecurity expert whose work has protected millions from the kind of crimes my family committed, whose expertise in the field they dismissed as worthless has built a career they couldn't imagine, whose choice to follow passion over expectation led to a success they never predicted. And I know with absolute certainty that their mockery was the greatest gift they ever gave me, because it freed me to become who I really was instead of who they needed me to be. And that freedom, that authenticity, that self-determination is worth more than any legacy built on lies, any approval based on conformity, any family that would only love me if I betrayed myself to become them. The months following that keynote speech brought unexpected changes, starting with a call from the Department of Justice wanting to hire me as a consultant for white-collar crime investigations, specifically cases involving the intersection of legal malpractice and technological fraud. And the irony of using my skills to help prosecute people like my family wasn't lost on me, but I accepted because justice had become personal in ways I'd never anticipated when I first discovered their crimes. My first case involved a law firm in New York suspected of using technology to manipulate evidence in high-stakes litigation, and I found myself sitting across from lawyers who reminded me painfully of my siblings. The same arrogance, the same dismissal of tech people as mere support staff, the same shock when they realized the person unraveling their schemes understood both their legal tactics and their technical methods better than they understood either. The lead partner, a woman who could have been Diana in another life, actually said during a deposition, "I don't see how someone without a law degree could possibly understand the complexities of what we do." And I had to suppress a bitter laugh, thinking of all the complexities I'd understood well enough to destroy an entire firm, all the patterns I'd seen that brilliant legal minds had missed because they thought themselves above technical details. Working with the DOJ gave me access to case files that revealed just how common my family's type of corruption was. How many prestigious firms built their success on crimes hidden behind legal jargon and technological ignorance, and I became known as the expert who could decode both languages, translate between legal and technical worlds, find the evidence that traditional investigators missed because they thought like lawyers or like coders, but rarely like both. The victims I met during these investigations haunted me. Elderly clients whose retirement funds had vanished into offshore accounts, small business owners destroyed by fraudulent billing, families torn apart by lawyers who saw them as ATMs rather than people needing help. And each story reinforced my conviction that I'd done the right thing exposing my family, that their crimes weren't victimless just because they wore expensive suits while committing them. One case particularly affected me, involving a firm that had stolen millions from a children's cancer charity. And as I traced the digital trail of their deception, I thought about my father's lectures on legacy and success, how he'd measure worth in billable hours while these children measured it in days they might not have, and I worked 18-hour days to ensure every cent was recovered, every criminal charged, every child's chance at treatment restored. The charity's director, a soft-spoken woman named Maria, who devoted her life to helping families navigate childhood cancer, broke down crying when I showed her how much we'd recovered, and she grabbed my hands and said, "You saved lives today, not with medicine, but with justice." And I thought about how my family had sneered at any career outside law, not understanding that justice could be served through many paths. My reputation in both tech and legal circles grew to the point where I was invited to teach a course at Stanford on cybersecurity and legal compliance, flying to California twice a month to stand before graduate students who hung on every word about finding vulnerabilities in systems both technical and legal. And I always started the semester with the same warning. The most dangerous assumption you can make is that your expertise makes you invulnerable to other forms of intelligence. During one lecture, a student raised his hand and asked, "Professor Torres, is it true you took down your own family's firm?" And I realized my anonymity had finally expired. The whispers becoming knowledge, the speculation becoming fact. And I made a decision to own it rather than hide from it, to use my story as another teaching tool rather than a secret shame. Yes, I said simply, I discovered my family's law firm was engaged in systematic fraud and I reported it, losing my family but gaining my integrity. And the classroom fell silent before erupting in questions about how I'd chosen justice over blood, how I'd found the strength to stand alone, how I'd built a new life from the ashes of the old. And I answered honestly, wanting them to understand that sometimes the hardest choices are the most necessary. The lecture went viral, someone having recorded my confession and shared it online with the title, "Professor Admits to Destroying Criminal Family Empire." And suddenly I was flooded with interview requests, book deals, documentary offers, everyone wanting to hear about the Torres whistleblower who'd chosen justice over family. And I turned most of them down, having no desire to profit from my family's downfall beyond the satisfaction of stopping their crimes. But I did accept one interview with a tech podcast that focused on ethical hacking and moral choices in cybersecurity, because I wanted my peers to understand that our skills came with responsibilities, that the ability to find vulnerabilities meant we had to choose between exploiting and protecting, between using our power for destruction or construction, and that choice defined us more than our technical abilities ever could. The hardest part, I told the interviewer, wasn't the technical challenge of gathering evidence or even the emotional pain of losing my family. It was the moment I realized I had to choose between complicity and conscience, between preserving a toxic relationship and preventing future victims, between being a good daughter and being a good person. And those aren't choices anyone should have to make. But when you do, you have to live with the consequences either way. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of messages from people who'd faced similar choices, who'd been mocked for their career paths, who'd been rejected by families that couldn't see beyond their own narrow definitions of success. And I realized my story had become bigger than just my experience, had become a symbol for everyone who'd chosen authenticity over approval, passion over expectation, integrity over belonging. I started a foundation with the money from my speaking engagements, providing scholarships and mentorship for young people in tech whose families didn't support their choices, creating the support system I'd wished I'd had, the encouragement that might have made those early years less lonely, and watching these brilliant minds flourish without family approval reminded me daily that we can create our own definitions of success. One scholarship recipient, a young woman named Anna, whose parents had threatened to disown her for choosing computer science over medicine, sent me a letter after graduating at the top of her class. "You showed me that losing family who only love conditional versions of you isn't really loss at all. It's liberation. And now I'm free to become who I really am instead of who they needed me to be." And I kept that letter on my desk as a reminder of why visibility mattered. The 5-year anniversary of the Torres firm's collapse brought unexpected media attention, retrospectives on one of Texas's biggest legal scandals, and several reporters managed to track down my siblings for comments, though what they got was telling. Diana refused to speak about it at all, while Robert claimed I'd misunderstood legitimate business practices, still unable to admit wrongdoing even after serving time, still convinced that their way had been right, despite all evidence to the contrary. My mother's book finally came out, titled From Judgment to Judged, A Fall from Grace. And though I didn't read it, the reviews told me enough. Critics noting that even in her supposed confession, she seemed unable to truly accept responsibility, framing their crimes as aggressive interpretation of legal boundaries, rather than the theft it had been, still protecting the family image, even as she pretended to expose it. The book's failure seemed fitting. the public uninterested in redemption narratives that lacked genuine accountability, and I heard through legal circles that she'd moved to a small town in Montana where no one knew the Torah's name, living quietly on what remained after victim restitution, a far cry from the federal judge who'd once declared me a failure for choosing technology over law, who'd banished me for refusing to continue their criminal legacy. Meanwhile, my career continued to soar in ways that would have been impossible within their narrow vision, consulting for Fortune 500 companies on security infrastructure, advising government agencies on cyber threats, building systems that protected millions from the kind of exploitation my family had perfected. And every success felt like another vindication of the path they'd mocked, proof that their definition of achievement had been fatally limited. I met regularly with my team, brilliant misfits who'd become family in the truest sense, people who celebrated each other's victories without competition, who understood that success meant lifting others up rather than stepping on them, who valued integrity over income, and in their acceptance I found what my birth family had never offered: unconditional support for who I authentically was, rather than who they needed me to be. The wedding anniversary with my spouse became an annual celebration not just of our marriage, but of chosen family, surrounding ourselves with people who'd stood by us through challenges my birth family would have fled from, who understood that love meant accepting someone's growth rather than demanding they remain static, who saw career changes and personal evolution as natural rather than betrayal. We decided to adopt rather than have biological children, wanting to give a home to kids who'd been rejected by their birth families just as I'd been, though for different reasons. And as we prepared for our first placement, I thought about the cycles we were breaking, the patterns we were refusing to perpetuate, the chance to show a child that family meant support rather than control, acceptance rather than conditions. The 10-year-old boy who joined our family had been through multiple foster homes, labeled difficult for questioning authority and refusing to conform, and I saw myself in his defiant eyes, the same determination to remain authentic despite pressure to change, the same confusion about why being himself wasn't enough for people who claimed to love him, and I promised him what my parents had never promised me: that he was perfect exactly as he was. Watching him flourish in an environment of acceptance rather than judgment, seeing his talents emerge when he wasn't forced into predetermined molds, reminded me daily that my parents' way had been wrong, not just legally but fundamentally, that children thrived when supported rather than controlled, when encouraged rather than molded, when loved for who they were rather than who they might become. The tech conference circuit became a regular part of my life, speaking about ethical hacking and corporate responsibility, but also about personal integrity and the courage to stand alone when necessary, and I always ended with the same message: your skills are powerful, but your choices about how to use them define who you are. And sometimes, the most important system you'll ever hack is the one that tells you success only looks one way. A young man approached me after one talk, tears in his eyes, and told me his family had cut him off for refusing to join their construction business, for choosing to pursue cybersecurity instead of continuing their blue-collar legacy, and I hugged him and told him what I wished someone had told me. Their inability to see your value doesn't diminish it, their definition of success doesn't invalidate yours, and their conditional love says everything about them and nothing about you. The investigations continued, each case revealing new ways that traditional professionals exploited technological ignorance, and I became expert at finding the intersection points, where legal knowledge became criminal through digital means, where respected firms became crime syndicates through systems they didn't understand well enough to hide, where arrogance about technical support staff became their downfall. One particularly satisfying case involved a senior partner who'd spent 20 minutes of his deposition explaining why my technical background made me unqualified to understand real professional work, only to watch his face crumble as I methodically demonstrated how his professional work included embezzling client funds through cryptocurrency transfers he thought were untraceable. His legal brilliance useless against someone who understood both languages fluently. The victim in that case, an elderly woman whose late husband's estate had been drained by legal fees that went straight to offshore accounts, hugged me after the verdict and whispered, "He kept saying I wouldn't understand because I wasn't educated enough, but you understood. You saw what he was doing. And I thought about all the times my family had used the same tactic, hiding crimes behind professional jargon and the assumption that others were too ignorant to catch them. My adoptive son, Marcus, showed an aptitude for music that reminded me of my own early love of coding. The same intense focus, the same joy in creation, the same disregard for conventional paths, and when he worried that we'd be disappointed he didn't want to follow either of our careers, I told him what my parents never told me. Your passion is your path, and we'll support wherever it leads, because success means becoming fully yourself, not copying someone else. Watching him perform at his first recital, seeing the pure joy on his face as he played piano with the same intensity I brought to coding, I thought about all the recitals my parents had missed because they were building their criminal empire, all the achievements they'd dismissed because they didn't fit their narrow vision, all the joy they'd sacrificed on the altar of their particular definition of success. The 15-year anniversary of my family's rejection approached, and with it came reflection on how different my life had become from their predictions, how the replaceable coder had become irreplaceable in fighting crimes they'd committed, how the failure had succeeded beyond their wildest imagination, how the daughter they'd thrown away had built everything they'd said was impossible, while they'd lost everything they'd said mattered most. A journalist doing a retrospective on the Torres scandal managed to interview Diana in prison, where she was serving her second sentence, this time for attempting to rebuild the same type of fraud in a different state, apparently having learned nothing except to hide it better, and her quote made me sad rather than angry. Rachel destroyed our family out of jealousy, because she could never be the lawyer we all were, still unable to see that being a lawyer had become synonymous with being a criminal in their hands. The final irony came when Stanford offered me a permanent position as professor of cybersecurity and legal ethics, a role that combined everything my family had said was impossible, bridging the gap between law and technology in ways they'd never imagined, teaching the next generation to see connections they'd been blind to value all forms of intelligence rather than dismissing what they didn't understand. My acceptance speech focused on the importance of diverse thinking and solving complex problems, on how my family's downfall had come from their inability to value knowledge outside their narrow field, from their assumption that legal expertise made them immune to other forms of intelligence, from their arrogance in dismissing skills they didn't possess as worthless, and I watched the audience of lawyers and technologists nod in understanding. We live in an interconnected world, I concluded, where artificial boundaries between fields of knowledge are not just limiting but dangerous, where assuming your expertise makes you superior to others is the first step toward the kind of blindness that allows corruption to flourish, where the skills you mock today might be the ones that save or destroy you tomorrow. And I thought of my father's sneer when he'd called me a basement dweller playing with computers. The students I taught went on to revolutionize both fields, bringing technological innovation to legal practice and legal ethics to tech companies, building bridges where my family had built walls, seeing connections where they'd seen only hierarchies, and each success story felt like another vindication of the path I'd chosen, proof that interdisciplinary thinking mattered more than narrow expertise. My son Marcus got accepted to Juilliard for piano, and at his acceptance dinner, surrounded by chosen family who erupted in genuine celebration, I thought about my own acceptance to the tech company that had started this journey, how my birth family had turned it into a funeral for their expectations rather than a celebration of my potential, how different love looked when it was unconditional rather than contingent on conformity. The book offers kept coming, but I finally accepted one, not for money but for the chance to tell the story properly, to explore the complexities of choosing justice over family, integrity over belonging, authenticity over approval. And I spent months writing what became less memoir than meditation on how we define success and failure, family and loyalty, identity and independence, the Torah's inheritance. Choosing Truth Over Tradition became a bestseller not because of the scandal, but because of its exploration of universal themes, the struggle between who we are and who others need us to be, between our authentic selves and the roles assigned to us, between easy conformity and difficult integrity. And readers found their own stories in mine, their own moments of choosing themselves over others' expectations. The book tour brought me face to face with thousands of people who'd made similar choices, who'd been called failures for refusing to follow prescribed paths, who'd lost families but found themselves. And in each city I visited, I held private meetings with young people facing the same decision I'd faced, offering not advice but solidarity. Not answers but affirmation that they weren't alone in choosing authenticity over approval. One young woman in Seattle, facing disownment for choosing social work over her family's medical dynasty, asked me if I ever regretted my choice, if I ever wished I'd just become the lawyer they'd wanted, if the family I'd lost was worth the integrity I'd gained. And I thought carefully before answering, wanting to be honest about both the pain and the liberation. I regret that my family could only love a version of me that didn't exist. I said finally. I regret that they built their lives on crimes I had to expose. I regret that choosing integrity meant losing them. But I don't regret choosing to be myself rather than their projection, because the person they wanted me to become would have been complicit in their crimes, would have perpetuated their harm. He would have betrayed everything I actually value for the sake of their approval. The signing line that night included a familiar face I hadn't expected. My cousin Elena, who'd maintained neutrality during the family collapse, neither supporting nor condemning my actions, and she approached with tears in her eyes, holding a worn copy of the book already filled with sticky notes and marginalia. "I need you to know," she said quietly, "that you saved more than just my family's victims. You saved me from becoming like them, from thinking that success required sacrificing integrity, from believing that family loyalty meant enabling crime, and I've spent these years rebuilding my own legal practice with ethics at the center, turning down cases that would have made me rich but compromised, choosing justice over income because you showed me it was possible." We hugged in the middle of the bookstore, two Torres women who'd chosen different paths than the one laid out for us, who'd defined success differently than our family taught us, who'd learned that integrity mattered more than income, that authenticity mattered more than approval, that choosing yourself sometimes meant losing others, but finding something more valuable in the process. The flight home from the final book tour stop gave me time to reflect on the journey from rejected daughter to respected professor, from failed lawyer to successful security expert, from family embarrassment to industry leader. And I realized that every prediction my father had made about my future had been wrong, not because he'd underestimated me, but because he'd misunderstood what success could look like. I thought about that dinner 15 years ago when he'd pointed at me and declared I'd be nothing but a replaceable coder begging for their acceptance by 30. And here I was at 35, irreplaceable in my field, teaching at Stanford, consulting for the government, raising a son who knew unconditional love, married to someone who valued growth over stasis, surrounded by chosen family who celebrated rather than competed, published and recognized, and fulfilled in ways they'd never imagined possible. The text message from an unknown number arrived as I landed. "This is Robert. I know you won't respond, but I need you to know that I understand now. Sitting in a minimum wage job because no firm will hire a disbarred lawyer, watching you on the news teaching at Stanford, seeing how wrong we all were about everything. You didn't destroy our family. We destroyed ourselves and tried to drag you down with us. Your only crime was refusing to drown. I didn't respond, but I saved the message, not out of forgiveness, but as evidence of something I'd always known but they'd been too arrogant to see, that their narrow definition of success had been their doom from the beginning, that dismissing other forms of intelligence and achievement had blinded them to both opportunity and threat, that building an empire on the assumption that only lawyers mattered in a world where everything was interconnected was like building on sand and being surprised when it collapsed. The evening news covered another law firm scandal, another group of brilliant legal minds who'd thought themselves above technology, above ethics, above consequences, and I watched with professional interest as investigators explained how digital evidence had exposed their crimes, how their assumption that computer people couldn't understand real professional work had been their downfall. And I thought about cycles repeating, patterns continuing, arrogance destroying itself over and over. My son came in as I watched, settling beside me on the couch with his homework, and asked, "Mom, Why do smart people do stupid things? And I thought about how to explain that intelligence without wisdom was dangerous, that expertise without ethics was destructive, that assuming your knowledge made you superior to others was often the first step toward your own downfall. Because, I said finally, they confuse being good at one thing with being good at everything. They assume their expertise makes them invincible. They dismiss what they don't understand as unimportant. And they forget that the world is bigger than their perspective. And he nodded thoughtfully, returning to his homework while I returned to watching another family empire fall to the same hubris that had destroyed mine. That night, I stood in my home office looking at the wall of achievements my family had said would never exist. Degrees they'd mocked, awards they'd said were impossible, books they'd never imagined, recognition they'd denied I could earn. And I felt not triumph, but peace. The quiet satisfaction of having proved nothing to them, but everything to myself, of having built exactly the life they'd said was worthless and finding it invaluable. The next morning brought another consulting request, another firm needing help understanding how their systems had been compromised, another group of professionals learning too late that dismissing technical expertise as lesser was a fatal flaw in the modern world. And I accepted the case knowing I'd find the same patterns, the same arrogance, the same assumption that their intelligence in one field made them immune to threats from another. As I prepared for the meeting, gathering my tools and expertise, I thought about that family dinner one last time, about their laughter when I'd announced my choice, their certainty that I was throwing my life away, their predictions of failure and mediocrity, and I realized their mockery had been the catalyst for everything good in my life, the push I'd needed to stop seeking their approval and start seeking my own truth. I am Rachel Torres, though I go by Rachel Chen now. My spouse's name feeling more like family than Torres ever did. 35 years old and at the height of a career they said was beneath me, teaching at a university they couldn't get into, solving crimes they committed, raising a family based on love rather than conditions, surrounded by people who value integrity over income, building a legacy of justice rather than theft, and living proof that sometimes the greatest success comes from failing to meet the wrong expectations, from choosing your own definition of achievement, from having the courage to disappoint people whose approval requires your disappearance.